There's one tribe that God himself erased from the book of eternity. Right here, where I'm standing, Israel's most notorious pagan temple once stood. In Revelation, 12 tribes are sealed for salvation. Dan is not among them. An entire bloodline cut off from redemption. And almost no one knows why.
722 years before Christ, Assyrian armies cross the borders of the northern kingdom of Israel. 10 tribes are deported to distant territories, among them Dan. From that moment on, no reliable historical record mentions this tribe again. But the historical silence is only half the mystery. The other half is in Revelation, where Dan was deliberately erased from the list of the saved. To understand how an entire tribe disappears from Scripture, you need to go back to the beginning, not to the exile, not to the idolatry, not to the conquest of Canaan, to the birth, to the tent of a desperate woman who would do anything to give a son to the husband she loved. Rachel was destroyed inside. Her older sister Leah, the woman Jacob never wanted, had already given 4 sons to the patriarch. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, 4 names, 4 heirs, 4 living proofs of blessed fertility. And Rachel, the beloved woman, the woman for whom Jacob worked 14 years, the woman he chose from the first moment he saw her by the well. Rachel could not conceive. Barrenness in the ancient Middle East was not just personal tragedy. It was public shame. It was a sign of divine curse. It was grounds for divorce. A wife who did not produce children failed in the only function that society considered essential. And Rachel knew this. She felt the weight of every glance. She heard the silence laden with judgment. She watched Leah's belly grow repeatedly while hers remained empty. Genesis 30 verse 1 records the desperation in raw words. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Jacob's response was equally intense. "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" But Rachel would not accept the situation passively. She did what Sarah had done generations before with Hagar. She gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob as a secondary wife, a legal solution at the time, a way to circumvent her own infertility using another woman's womb. Children born to Bilhah would be legally considered Rachel's children, and Bilhah conceived. When the boy was born, Rachel held the child in her arms, a child who biologically was not hers, but whom law and custom made hers, and declared in Genesis 30 verse 6, "God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called him Dan. The name literally means he judged or judge. In Hebrew, the root is din, which carries connotations of judgment, justice, legal decision. Rachel saw in that birth a vindication. God had judged her cause and decided in her favor. Finally, she had a son. Finally, the shame was diminishing. The irony is brutal when you know the rest of the story. A child named in reference to favorable divine judgment would become the ancestor of the tribe most negatively judged in Scripture. The name that celebrated victory would become a harbinger of defeat. The word that meant justice would connect to a lineage marked by spiritual injustice. The name was prophecy before Jacob even opened his mouth about the future of his sons. Bilhah had another son after Dan. Rachel called him Naphtali, saying she had wrestled with her sister and won 2 children through the servant. Then, finally, Rachel's own womb opened. Joseph was born, and much later Benjamin, Jacob's last son, whose arrival cost Rachel her life in childbirth. But Dan remained as the firstborn of the secondary mothers. Son of a servant, yes, but still a son of Jacob. Still part of the family that would become a nation. Still founder of one of the 12 tribes that would inherit the promised land. Dan's childhood took place in the tense environment of a polygamous family. 4 women, 12 sons from different mothers, constant competition for attention and favor, jealousies that would culminate in the sale of Joseph as a slave by his own brothers. It was a cauldron of family conflicts that would shape each of those. Boys in different ways. The scriptures do not record specific details about Dan as an individual. We do not know if he actively participated in the conspiracy against Joseph. We do not know if he tried to intervene like Reuben or profit like Judah. The silence about his individual actions is, in a way, the first silence of many that would mark this lineage. What we know is that Dan went down to Egypt along with the rest of the family when famine devastated Canaan. Genesis 46, verse 23, lists only one son of Dan in that migration, Hushim, a small family compared to other tribes. Benjamin, the youngest, took 10 sons. Dan took only 1. 400 years passed in Egypt. The family of 70 people multiplied into a nation of hundreds of thousands. The descendants of Dan grew, multiplied, were enslaved along with the rest of Israel, cried out under the weight of Egyptian bricks, and were finally freed on the night of Passover. In the census recorded in Numbers chapter 1, conducted in the wilderness of Sinai after the Exodus, the tribe of Dan numbered 62,700 men fit for war. It was the second largest tribe, losing only to Judah with its 74,600. Dan's only son had multiplied into an impressive multitude. Numbers chapter 2 establishes the organization of the Israelite camp in the wilderness. Dan led the northern group along with Asher and Naphtali. They marched last when the people moved. They were the rear guard, the rear protection against any attack that might come from behind. The position was not dishonor, it was strategic responsibility. But it is interesting to note that Dan was literally at Israel's back. The tribe that Jacob would compare to a serpent that bites, heels occupied the position closest to the heels of the entire camp. Decades later, when Jacob had long since died, when the Exodus was ancestral memory, when a new generation was preparing to finally enter Canaan, something happened that would cast a shadow over Dan forever. Jacob was dying when he pronounced the words that would define each tribe. The patriarch gathered his 12 sons around the bed in Egypt. He was 147 years old. He had seen more than any man should see: deception, betrayal, loss, reconciliation, famine, abundance, exile, reunion. Now, at the end, he looked at his sons' faces and saw beyond them. He saw the nations they would become, the destinies that would unfold through the centuries. Genesis 49 records the prophetic blessings. Each son received specific words. Some were clearly positive. Judah would be a lion, the scepter would not depart from him. Joseph would be a fruitful branch, blessed with blessings from the heavens above and the deep below. Others were clearly negative. Reuben would lose the birthright for having lain with his father's concubine. Simeon and Levi would be scattered because of the violence in Shechem. When Dan's turn came, the words were different from all the others, ambiguous, disturbing. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Up to this point, promise, dignity, judicial authority. The tribe whose name meant judge would exercise the role of judging. It made sense. It was consistent with the etymology. It was honor. But then came the rest. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. No other son received such a sinister animal image. Judah was compared to a lion, king of animals, majestic, powerful. Benjamin was compared to a wolf, fierce, yes, but respected. Issachar was compared to a strong donkey, not glamorous but hard-working and resilient. Naphtali was compared to a deer, swift, free, graceful. But Dan was a serpent, a viper, a crawling creature, a creature that attacks from behind, hidden at the roadside, waiting for the moment to strike when the victim least expects. A creature associated since Genesis 3 with deception, curse, enmity against humanity. And not just any serpent, a serpent that bites heels, a serpent that topples riders. The image is of calculated betrayal, of attack when the target is vulnerable, of destruction that comes from where least expected. Generations of scholars have debated the meaning. Some see a prophetic reference to Samson, the most famous judge the tribe of Dan would produce. Samson attacked the Philistines in unexpected ways, using unconventional strategies, exploiting weaknesses. He tied torches to foxes. He used a donkey's jawbone as a weapon. He brought down a temple on himself and his enemies. There was something serpentine about his methods, lethal cunning, oblique attacks, strength hidden beneath an appearance of vulnerability. Other scholars see something darker, a prediction of the spiritual path the tribe would choose to follow, a tendency toward betrayal, not against external enemies, but against the God of Israel himself. The serpent that would bite the people's heels would not be Danite military force against Philistines. It would be Danite idolatry against the faith of their brothers. There is also an inverted messianic interpretation. If the serpent of Genesis 3 struck the heel of the woman's seed, and Dan is compared to a serpent that bites heels, some see a disturbing connection here. Ancient Jewish traditions suggested that the Antichrist, who bore in Jewish terminology a figure of final opposition to the Messiah, would come from the tribe of Dan. Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century mentioned this belief. The original serpent attacked humanity. The serpent of Dan would attack Israel. The logic is dark, but the textual connection exists. What no one disputes is the brutal contrast within the chapter itself. In the same text where Judah receives the promise of the eternal scepter and the right to command the obedience of the peoples, where Joseph receives abundant blessings from the heavens above and the deep below, where the tribes are compared to noble animals and forces of nature, in that same text, Dan receives the image of a cobra waiting to strike. And then comes verse 18, immediately after the prophecy about Dan, "I wait for your salvation, O Lord." The phrase seems disconnected. It interrupts the flow of blessings. Jacob was talking about serpents and riders falling, and suddenly cries out for divine salvation, as if the patriarch, contemplating Dan's future, immediately needed to remember that there was still hope in God, as if what he saw was too disturbing to leave without spiritual counterweight. Some commentators suggest that Jacob, at that moment, saw beyond Dan. He saw the entire history of Israel. He saw falls and exiles and sufferings that would come. And he cried out for the salvation that only God could bring. Others suggest that the cry was specifically about Dan, a prayer that the tribe of the serpent would still find redemption despite the tortuous path it would follow. The text does not explain. It leaves the ambiguity hanging, and that ambiguity would extend throughout Dan's history. A tribe that began with the promise of just judgment and ended up being judged. A tribe that could have been anything and chose to become exactly what the darkest prophecy suggested. When Israel finally conquered Canaan under Joshua's leadership, each tribe received a specific territorial portion. The division was not random. It followed strategic logic, considered geographical characteristics, and fulfilled ancestral promises made centuries before. The tribe of Judah received the extensive south, including the region that would become Jerusalem. Ephraim and Manasseh, sons of Joseph, divided the fertile center. Benjamin got a strategic strip between Judah and the northern tribes. Each portion reflected something about the tribe that would receive Dan received a coastal strip between Judah and Ephraim, territory that included cities like Zorah, Eshtaol, Ir-Shemesh, Aijalon, and extended to the region that today would be near Tel Aviv. In theory, it was an excellent portion. access to the sea, fertile plain, trade routes. In practice, it was a battlefield. The Philistines occupied the coastal plain with military force that Israel simply could not match. They had iron technology when Israel was still working predominantly with bronze. The secret of iron smelting was a carefully guarded Philistine monopoly. 1 Samuel 13 records that there was no blacksmith in all the land of Israel. The Philistines had eliminated the profession to prevent the Hebrews from making weapons. The Philistines had fortified cities built with advanced techniques. They had professional armies trained in coordinated tactics. They had war chariots, technology that turned battles into massacres when faced by disorganized infantry. And they had no intention of ceding territory to a tribe of former slaves newly arrived from the desert. Joshua 19, verse 47, records the situation with brutal economy of words. And the territory of the people of Dan went out beyond them. Direct translation: they could not conquer what was promised to them. The Philistine pressure was so intense, so constant, so suffocating that the Danites were squeezed into a minimal strip of land. They did not control the fertile plains. They did not access the trade routes. They did not enjoy the advantages that the territory theoretically offered. They lived cornered in the hills, looking down, seeing the land that should be theirs, occupied by enemies they could not defeat. Judges, chapter 1, verses 34 and 35 details. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. It was not just the Philistines. The Amorites also pressed. Dan was surrounded, compressed, unable to expand in any direction. The tribe that should judge its people could not even guarantee space to live. And then they made a decision that would define the tribe's character forever. Instead of fighting for the territory designated by God, they migrated. Instead of trusting the promises and facing enemies as the other tribes did, they sought an easier way out. Instead of crying out to the Lord for victory, as Judah did, as Ephraim did, as even Benjamin, the smallest of tribes, did, Dan decided that the problem was not lack of faith, it was lack of adequate land. Judges chapter 18 narrates the complete story with details that reveal both courage and corruption, both determination and spiritual deviation. The Danites sent 5 spies to search for new land, men of valor, the text says, competent warriors chosen for reconnaissance mission. The order was clear: traverse the land, examine the options, find a place where we can settle. The 5 traveled to the far north of Israel, far beyond the territory of any tribe. They came to a city called Laish, also known as Leshem in some texts. What they found seemed the perfect answer to Dan's problems. Laish was inhabited by a people described as quiet and unsuspecting. They lived like the Sidonians, prosperous, peaceful, carefree. They had no strong military alliances. They were geographically isolated, far from any potential help. The city was in a fertile, well-irrigated valley, abundant in resources. It was easy prey. The report the spies brought back was explicit: arise and let us go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, to enter in and possess the land. When you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people, and the land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth. The language is almost comical in its frankness. We found unprepared people. Good land, no one to defend. Let's go take it. But on the way back, the spies made a stop that would change everything. They passed through the hill country of Ephraim and entered the house of a man named Micah. Micah was a peculiar character. Judges 17 tells his story as a prelude to chapter 18. He had stolen 1,100 pieces of silver from his own mother. When she cursed the unknown thief, Micah confessed and returned the money. The mother, relieved, dedicated 200 pieces to make a carved image and a metal image. Idols, basically. With these idols, Micah set up a complete household shrine. He made an ephod, priestly garment normally reserved for Levites. He made teraphim, figurines associated with divination and household cults. He consecrated one of his own sons as priest of the private shrine, and then a Levite appeared. The young man came from Bethlehem of Judah, wandering in search of a place to live. Micah hired him. He offered 10 pieces of silver per year, plus clothes, plus food. The Levite accepted. Micah was satisfied. "Now I know that the Lord will prosper me, because I have a Levite as priest." The irony is dense. Micah thought that having a Levite legitimized his illegal shrine. He thought God would approve because the form was correct. Priest from the right. Tribe, even though the content was completely wrong. Idols made with stolen silver. Ephod manufactured without authorization. Teraphim forbidden by the law of Moses. But he had a Levite, so everything was fine. The 5 Danite spies stopped at Micah's house during the reconnaissance trip. They recognized the Levite's voice. Perhaps they knew him from Bethlehem. Perhaps the accent was distinctive. They asked what he was doing there. He explained the arrangement, and then they asked him to inquire of God about their mission. The Levite inquired. He responded favorably. "Go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord." The spies stored the location in memory. They stored the information about the idols. They stored the knowledge about the available Levite. And they continued toward Laish. When they returned with the positive report, 600 Danite warriors prepared for the march. 600 armed men, with families, with belongings, with everything they had. It was not a temporary military expedition. It was permanent migration. They were abandoning the territory designated by God to conquer another that they chose on their own. And on the way, they made a detour. They returned to Micah's house. The 5 spies guided the 600 to the exact location. While the warriors positioned themselves at the gate, the 5 entered the shrine. They took the carved image, the ephod, the teraphim, the metal image. They took everything. The Levite, standing at the gate with the 600 armed warriors, asked what they were doing. The response was a proposal he could not refuse. "Keep quiet. Put your hand on your mouth and come with us and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be priest to the house of one man, or to be priest to a tribe and a clan in Israel?" The logic was simple. You can be Micah's private priest, or you can be priest of an entire tribe. Instant promotion. The Levite did not hesitate. He took the ephod, the teraphim, the carved image, and joined the column of migrants. Micah discovered the theft and pursued the Danites with armed neighbors. He caught up with the column and confronted them. "You take my gods that I made and the priest and go away. And what have I left? How then do you ask? Mibwe, what is the matter with you?" The Danites' response was pure threat. "Do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household." Angry fellows, warriors with violent temperament. "If you keep complaining, we will kill you and your entire family." Micah calculated the odds, he and some neighbors against 600 armed warriors, and went home, alone, without gods, without priest, without anything. The Danites continued toward Laish. The conquest was efficient massacre. The people of Laish lived exactly as the spies had described. Quiet, secure, unsuspecting. They had no adequate walls. They had no prepared army. They had no alliances they could call for help. 600 warriors attacked at dawn. They killed the population. They burned the city. They left no survivors to tell the story or seek revenge. On the ashes, they rebuilt. They gave the place a new name, Dan, and in the center of the newly baptized city, they erected the stolen idols. Judges 18, verses 30 and 31, record the result with disturbing clarity. "And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan the son of Gershom, son of Moses, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up Micah's carved image that he made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. The Levite had a name, Jonathan, and he had lineage, son of Gershom, son of Moses, grandson of Moses himself who had received the law on Sinai, grandson of the man who broke the tablets upon seeing the golden calf, grandson of the leader who executed 3,000 idolaters after that episode. And this grandson of Moses became priest of stolen idols for a tribe that abandoned its territory. The irony is crushing. The corruption was already so advanced that even Moses' family participated in institutionalized idolatry. And Dan did not just tolerate, Dan hosted, Dan made it official. Dan transformed it into tribal state religion. And here is the detail that reveals the temporal extent of the problem. The text says that this arrangement lasted until the day of the captivity of the land. This means that idolatry in Dan persisted from the time of the Judges, approximately 1,200 years before Christ, until the Assyrian deportation in 722. Almost 500 years of continuous worship of stolen idols. Generations being born, living and dying under the shadow of gods that did not even originally belong to them. And the second detail is equally revealing. The sanctuary of Dan functioned as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. Shiloh was where the legitimate tabernacle was, where Levitical priests ministered according to the law of Moses, where the people should go to worship the true God. Two systems functioning simultaneously, one ordained by God, another improvised for convenience and built on theft and violence, and Dan chose the second. The tribe did not fall into idolatry by external accident. It was not influenced by pagan neighbors to adopt strange practices. It chose idolatry as the foundation of the new city. The idols were not gradual infiltration. They were trophies of conquest. They were the first thing they erected in the new territory, before permanent houses, before defensive walls, before any civil infrastructure. The false gods first. In the midst of this stained lineage, a figure emerges who defies all expectations. A man who personifies both the potential and the tragedy of Dan, Samson. Samson's birth is narrated in Judges chapter 13 with solemnity that contrasts dramatically with Dan's history up to that point. An angel of the Lord appeared to a barren woman in Zorah, Dan's original territory, before the migration to the north. The woman was married to Manoah, a Danite. The angel announced that she would conceive and have a son, but not just any son. Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. A Nazirite from the womb, set apart for God before even being born. No blade would touch his head, no grape product would pass his lips, no dead body would be touched, and he would begin, not complete, just begin, to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Manoah asked for confirmation. The angel appeared again. Manoah offered a sacrifice. When the flames went up from the altar, the angel ascended with them and disappeared. Manoah fell with his face to the ground, convinced they would die for having seen God. His wife, more pragmatic, argued that if God wanted to kill them, he would not have accepted the sacrifice or revealed these things. The child was born. They called him Samson. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in the camp of Dan. The irony continues to accumulate. The tribe that could not face the Philistines and fled north produced the man who caused the most damage to the Philistines in all of Israel's history. The people who abandoned the fight brought forth the nation's greatest warrior. The lineage that chose the easy path brought into the world someone whose strength had no parallel. Samson killed a lion with his bare hands. He killed 30 Philistines in Ashkelon to pay a bet. He killed 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone at Lehi. He burned entire plantations by tying torches to 300 foxes and releasing them in the wheat fields. He tore off the gates of Gaza. gates that would weigh hundreds of pounds, and carried them on his shoulders to the top of a mountain 40 kilometers away. He brought down the temple of Dagon on 3,000 Philistines gathered to celebrate his capture, but physical strength coexisted with devastating moral weakness. Samson was attracted to Philistine women, exactly the people he should be fighting. His first wife was from Timnah, a Philistine city. Then he visited a prostitute in Gaza. Finally, Delilah, who betrayed him for 1,100 pieces of silver from each of the Philistine lords. Samson's personal tragedy mirrors his tribe's collective tragedy. Extraordinary strength wasted by poor choices, divine potential sabotaged by his own desires, impressive victories followed by self-inflicted defeats, separation to God compromised by involvement with the forbidden. Samson broke every aspect of the Nazirite vow except the hair, until Delilah discovered the secret. He touched a dead body when he ate honey from the lion he had killed. He probably drank wine at the wedding feast that lasted 7 days. As was Philistine custom, only the hair remained untouched. And when he finally lost that too, he lost everything. Samson died blind, chained, doing animal labor at a Philistine mill. Hair shaved, eyes gouged out, strength gone. The most powerful man in Israel reduced to entertainment for his enemies. His last act was prayer and destruction simultaneously. O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. He embraced the central pillars of Dagon's temple. He pushed with all his restored strength. The building collapsed. 3,000 Philistines died, and Samson with them. Final victory mixed with suicide. Glory wrapped in tragedy. The text summarizes, "So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his life." Dan produced a hero who could have completely liberated Israel, and lost. That hero to the same weaknesses that defined the tribe: attraction to the forbidden, relationships with pagans, confidence in his own power instead of exclusive dependence on God. The serpent that bites heels manifested in constant self-sabotage. When Samson died, his family came to get the body and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in Dan's ancestral territory. Judges ends shortly after, with stories of civil chaos and fratricidal war. Dan's story in the book does not end with national victory. It ends with a body being carried back home, and a tribe that had already established itself in institutionalized idolatry in the north. Centuries passed. The period of the judges gave way to the monarchy. Saul was anointed and rejected. David unified the tribes and established Jerusalem as capital. Solomon built the temple and expanded the kingdom to unprecedented glory. But Solomon also planted the seeds of division: marriages to foreign women, tolerance of pagan cults, heavy taxes on the northern tribes, forced labor for construction projects. The prosperous kingdom was tense inside. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. The northern tribes sent a delegation asking for relief. "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." Solomon's elders counseled leniency. The young men who grew up with Rehoboam counseled harshness. Rehoboam listened to the young men. He responded with arrogance. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." The reaction was immediate. "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David." 10 tribes separated under Jeroboam's leadership. Judah and Benjamin remained in the south, faithful to the Davidic line. Israel was divided, and Dan was on the side that chose independence. Jeroboam had an immediate political problem. The temple was in Jerusalem. If his subjects continued going up to worship there 3 times a year, their loyalty would be divided. Sooner or later, hearts would turn back to Rehoboam. Religion would pull politics. The northern kingdom would dissolve. The king needed a local religious alternative. He needed to give the people a reason not to go down to Jerusalem. He needed his own sanctuaries. The solution recorded in 1 Kings chapter 12 was to create two rival sanctuaries, one in Bethel at the southern extreme of his kingdom, convenient for the tribes closest to Judah, another in Dan at the northern extreme, convenient for the most distant tribes, and in each sanctuary a golden calf. The text records Jeroboam's exact words, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Words almost identical to what Aaron pronounced in the wilderness 400 years earlier when he molded the calf while Moses was on the mountain. The same sin, the same excuse, the same idolatry dressed in convenience, the same phrase used to justify the substitution of the true God for a manufactured image. And Dan accepted. Of all the cities in the northern kingdom, Jeroboam chose Dan to host one of the calves, the city that already had a 500-year history of an idolatrous sanctuary, the tribe that was already accustomed to irregular worship. The ground was prepared by generations. Resistance would be minimal. In fact, there might even be enthusiasm. Finally, official recognition for what they were already doing. 1 Kings 12, verse 30 declares, "And this thing became a sin, for the people went as far as Dan to be before one." The phrase is geographically significant. The people went as far as Dan. Not just the local Danites. People from all over the northern kingdom traveled to the northern extreme of the territory to worship. Dan became a center of idolatrous pilgrimage, a pole of inverted spiritual attraction, a temple city dedicated to a false god. What had been tribal sin became national sin with Dan as the epicenter, and it remained so for 200 years. Prophet after prophet condemned the golden calves. Ahijah of Shiloh prophesied against the house of Jeroboam. Jehu proclaimed judgment on the wicked kings. Elijah confronted Ahab and the prophets of Baal. Elisha continued the prophetic ministry with miracles and denunciations. Hosea cried out against Israel's spiritual unfaithfulness. Amos thundered against social injustice and empty religion. All denounced the systematic idolatry of the northern kingdom. All were ignored. Hosea chapter 8 verse 5 cries out, "He has rejected your calf, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of innocence?" Amos chapter 8 verse 14 prophesies specifically, "Those who swear by the guilt of Samaria and say, 'As your God lives, O Dan, and as the way of Beersheba lives, they shall fall and never rise again.'" The prophecy names Dan directly. It announces irreversible fall. Never rise again. The sentence is pronounced with clarity that leaves no room for ambiguity. Those who swore by the God of Dan would fall, and there would be no recovery. And then came 722 before Christ. The Assyrians were the most efficient war machine the ancient world had ever seen. An empire built on systematic violence, mass deportation, and calculated psychological terror. Their stone reliefs showed cities being sacked, prisoners being impaled, populations marching in chains to exile. It was not exaggerated propaganda. It was precise documentation. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, the empire had begun to pressure Israel. Menahem paid tribute. Pekah was partially conquered. Hoshea, the last king of the north, initially submitted. But then he tried to play the Assyrians against the Egyptians, seeking alliance with Pharaoh So. Shalmaneser V did not tolerate the betrayal. The Assyrian army marched on Samaria. The siege lasted 3 years. Inside the walls, famine devastated. Outside, the Assyrians waited with methodical patience. In 722, Sargon II, who had assumed the throne during the siege, conquered the city. the king of Israel, was taken captive. The population was deported to Assyria, Halah, Habor, the river of Gozan, and the cities of the Medes. 2 Kings chapter 17 records the fall with somber solemnity and explains the theological reason. And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt, and had feared other gods, and walked in the customs of the nations, whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. The text continues listing specific sins: high places, pillars, Asherim, worship of the host of heaven, service to Baal. Children pass through fire, divination, sorcery, selling themselves to do evil. And then comes verse 21. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord, and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight. The golden calves are pointed to as the central cause. Jeroboam drove Israel away. Israel did not depart from Jeroboam's sins, and Dan had been the seat of one of those calves for 200 years. The deportation was systematic. It was not simply expelling people, it was replacing entire populations. In place of the Israelites, foreign peoples were brought to occupy the territory. People from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. Each group brought their own gods. The land that should be holy became a mixture of incompatible cults. It was deliberate Assyrian policy. Removing native populations and replacing them with foreigners prevented nationalist revolts. Displaced people had no connection to the land. They had no ancestral memory to inspire resistance. They had no shared identity to unify rebellion. Dan was in the direct path of invasion. The city was at the northern extreme, a natural entry point for armies coming from Syria and Mesopotamia. It would be one of the first to fall. And when it fell, the population was dispersed among the Assyrian provinces like all the others. From that moment on, silence. The 10 northern tribes disappear from historical records as recognizable ethnic entities. Some traditions call them the lost tribes of Israel. Theories proliferate about possible fates. Human imagination filled the vacuum left by history. Some claim they migrated to Ethiopia. The Beta Israel community claims to descend specifically from the tribe of Dan, based on oral traditions that narrate migration through Egypt and Sudan to the Ethiopian highlands. In 1973, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel recognized the Beta Israel as Jews, and in subsequent decades, airlifts brought tens of thousands to Israel. Others suggest connections with European peoples. British Israelism theories trace dubious etymological connections. Dan would have become Danmark, Denmark, or left traces in the river Danube. Celtic tribes would have been migrated Israelites. The ancient Irish would be descendants. These theories completely lack serious archaeological or linguistic basis, but remain popular in certain circles. There are those who trace connections to populations in India, Afghanistan, Japan, China. Isolated communities that maintain practices vaguely similar to Jewish ones are claimed as lost tribes. The Bene Israel of Mumbai, the B'nai Menashe of northeastern India, the Pashtuns of Afghanistan, even the Japanese in some more creative theories. None of these theories has solid historical evidence. What archaeological and documentary evidence shows is simpler and more tragic. Populations deported by the Assyrians were systematically assimilated, mixed marriages, adoption of local languages, abandonment of distinctive practices, constant cultural pressure for imperial conformity. In 2 or 3 generations, the original identity dissolved into the social fabric of the empire. Children of deportees did not speak their parents' language. Grandchildren did not know their grandparents' stories. Great-grandchildren did not know where the family had come from. It was social engineering on an imperial scale, and it worked with brutal efficiency. Dan did not just disappear geographically, it disappeared ethnically, culturally, spiritually. The serpent prophesied by Jacob bit its own heels until nothing recognizable remained. And then we come to the last book of the Bible. Revelation chapter 7 describes a breathtaking heavenly scene. 4 angels positioned at the 4 corners of the earth hold the 4 winds, preventing them from blowing on earth, sea, or tree. A 5th angel ascends from the rising sun, carrying the seal of the living God. His voice resounds as a command: do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. The number is specific: 144,000 sealed, 12,000 from each tribe of Israel. The list begins with Judah, the royal tribe, the tribe of Christ, then Reuben, the firstborn who lost the birthright, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. 12 names, 12 tribes, 12,000 from each. But compare with the original list in Genesis. Someone is missing. Dan is not there. The omission jumps out at any attentive reader. It is impossible not to notice when you know the tribal lists of the Old Testament. Jacob's 12 sons were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. In Revelation, Dan disappears. Manasseh, who was Joseph's son, not Jacob's direct son, appears separately. Joseph also appears, presumably representing Ephraim, his other son. Levi, who was normally not counted as a territorial tribe because the Levites received no land inheritance, is included. But Dan simply vanished. No mention, no representation, no substitute with direct connection. The space that would be Dan's was filled by Manasseh, a half-tribe. Why the omission? Scholars offer multiple explanations, none completely satisfactory, all carrying the weight of centuries of theological debate. The most cited explanation connects with the patristic tradition that the Antichrist would come from the tribe of Dan. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 AD, mentioned this interpretation in Against Heresies. The textual basis would be Jacob's prophecy about the serpent combined with Jeremiah chapter 8 verse 16. The snorting of their horses is heard from Dan. At the sound of the neighing of their stallions, the whole land quakes. If the Antichrist would come from Dan, the tribe could not be among those sealed for protection. It would be on the other side. It would be a source of final opposition, not preserved faithfulness. Another explanation is simpler and perhaps more likely. Dan had disappeared as an ethnic entity centuries before John wrote Revelation. When the vision was recorded, probably at the end of the 1st century AD, no one knew where Dan's descendants were. The tribe no longer existed in recognizable form. Including it would be listing an extinct people, an abstraction without corresponding reality. A third possibility combines both. The persistence in idolatry from the judges to the deportation resulted in definitive consequence. The serpent prophesied by Jacob fulfilled its path to the end, and the end was erasure, not arbitrary erasure, but erasure as the logical result of a chosen trajectory. Generations of departure produced disappearance that the sacred text itself recognizes by excluding. There are still those who argue that the list in Revelation 7 is not intended to be genealogically precise. It is symbolic. It represents the totality of God's people, not a literal count of biological descendants. In this reading, Dan's Omission would be less significant, just a variation in the many tribal lists that appear throughout Scripture, which are never completely uniform. But even in this interpretation, the question remains: why vary exactly at this point? Why omit exactly Dan? If the list is symbolic, symbols still carry meaning, and the meaning of absence is as real as the meaning of presence. What no one disputes is the raw, textual fact. 11 original tribes plus Levi appear in Revelation 7. Dan does not appear, whether permanent theological punishment, whether a reflection of irreversible historical disappearance, whether a combination of both, whether a redactional accident that no one can adequately explain, the result is identical. The tribe that began with a name of judgment ended up being judged. The tribe that should judge its people was judged by history and by the sacred text. Later traditions tried to rescue Dan in different ways. The belief that the Beta Israel descend from Dan offers a kind of narrative redemption. The tribe would not have completely disappeared. It would have found refuge in the mountains of Ethiopia, preserved its identity through millennia, and finally returned to Israel in the 20th century. It is a beautiful story. It offers satisfying closure, but historically it is unlikely. The Beta Israel have distinctive Jewish practices, but also significant differences from Rabbinic Judaism. They do not celebrate post-biblical holidays like Hanukkah or Purim. Their Judaism seems to derive from a period before the Babylonian exile, not from specific Danite migration. More likely is that ancient Jewish communities, perhaps from the Second Temple period, perhaps even earlier, migrated south and settled in Ethiopia, eventually developing their own traditions in isolation. The connection to Dan would be a later construction, an attempt to explain mysterious origins through available biblical narrative. The mystery remains precisely because history chose silence. Assyrian records documented deportations, but did not track individual fates of each ethnic group. Deported peoples were deliberately mixed. Identities were diluted by imperial policy. Recovering the thread of a specific tribe through 2,700 years of history is a task that borders on the impossible. What remains of Dan are the biblical mentions. The birth through Bilhah, the name that means judgment, the prophecy of the serpent from dying Jacob's mouth, the coastal territory lost to Philistine pressure, the decision to migrate instead of fight, the brutal conquest of Laish, the idols stolen from Micah, the parallel sanctuary that functioned while the legitimate tabernacle was in Shiloh, Samson, tragic hero who embodied both the potential and the ruin of his tribe, Jeroboam's golden calf. 200 years as a center of idolatrous pilgrimage. The prophets crying out ignored warnings, the Assyrian deportation, and finally, definitively, the absence in Revelation. It is a trajectory that fits in a few paragraphs but spans more than 1,000 years of history, and it ends not with an explosion, but with silence. Not with a dramatic declaration, but with eloquent omission. The name simply is not where it should be, and that not being says more than any explicit condemnation could say. Dan's story is not about inevitable curse predetermined from birth. Jacob saw potential for just judgment before he saw treacherous serpent. The first verse of the prophecy promised legitimate judicial authority. The problem was not in genetics or cosmic destiny, it was in the pattern of choices. Generation after generation taking the easier path, fleeing instead of fighting for the promised territory, stealing idols instead of worshipping as commanded, accepting golden calves instead of resisting political convenience, ignoring prophets instead of repenting. Each decision had its own logic at the time. Each step seemed reasonable viewed in isolation. Migrating north was a practical solution to unbearable Philistine pressure. Taking Micah's idols seemed to guarantee spiritual prosperity for the new city. After all, the Levite had given a favorable blessing. Accepting Jeroboam's sanctuary avoided the long and dangerous journey to Jerusalem 3 times a year. Why risk the roads when worship could happen close to home? But choices accumulate, directions consolidate, shortcuts become main roads, exceptions become rules. And in the end, a tribe that had a guaranteed place among the 12 ended up with no place on the final list. Manasseh, a half-tribe, occupies Dan's place in the list of Revelation. It was not a copyist's error. It was not a textual accident. It was deliberate substitution. Someone, whether the human author John, whether the divine inspiration behind the text, whether both working together, chose not to include Dan and to include Manasseh in its place. Dan's story teaches something that no scroll needs to explain in words. Lineage is not destiny. Inheritance is not guarantee. A name can be written among the 12 and then crossed out. Ancestral promises are not automatically fulfilled. Patriarchal blessings do not operate independently of human response. The space that Dan occupied still exists, but it is filled by another name. And this raises a question that the biblical text leaves echoing through the centuries. What we do with the place we were given matters more than the place itself.